Good evening, good evening. Welcome to tonight's webinar. I'm going to wait about 30 seconds or so, let everybody enter the room. I see people are coming in. Happy to have you all here tonight. Look forward to, I hope it's going to be a informative and helpful discussion. We'll have questions and answers. We're going to share a recording of this. So if you want to share this with someone you love or dislike, you can do that later on. We'll send that to you probably early next week after we ran to record it and mail it out to you. So yeah, we're talking about everything college admissions tonight in terms of getting ready for the big show. You guys are your parents of sophomores, and then next year things get more interesting. We start with testing, college visits, and then they're going to be applying to college in about a year and a half. So things are getting real. And we'll talk about the nuances, what's changed, things you should be thinking about, what's really important. So why don't we, it's 8:01. I guess I see people still filtering in. Take one more second. All right, that's a good number there. Why don't we jump in? All right, so I'm Dr. Jed Applerouth, about 21 years, been working with students, helping kids go through this process of testing and talking about college. So I want to share things I've learned over these several decades with y'all, and hopefully answer questions you might have if this is your first time through the process and so forth. Let's jump right in. Okay, here we go. So tonight we're going to talk about the process, applying to college, what it entails, the pieces, talk about testing. That's a big part of what we do here at Applerouth. And then look at next steps, the final pieces for what you have to do this year, then next year, and then when you're seniors for your kids. All right, so to begin with, applying to college. There are multiple ways to apply to college, and you'll learn about this soon enough if you haven't already heard. Early action, early decision, regular decision, rolling admissions, priority admissions, single choice, early action. Lots of different ways of applying, and the most basic is just regular decision, and that's typically what many of you knew about. And if you did, you apply, often it's a January 1st deadline. Application goes in, they read it, they give you an answer sometime mid-March to early April, and then you have to deposit by May 1st, and then you're off to the races. That's regular. But then there's early, and early is looming larger and larger. Early used to be relatively rare, but now it's like the new normal. So many kids are applying at least to 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 schools. Early action. Early action is non-binding in most cases. Early action, like you apply to Georgia, you apply to Tech, you apply to so many schools, early action, and you can apply to often many schools. If it's unrestricted, I can apply to many schools early. There are a handful of super selective schools that have something called restrictive early action. That happened a couple of years back when Harvard and Princeton and Yale dropped early decision, and instead they said you have single choice early action. So you're not bound to come, but you only apply to our school and often your state flagship school early, and the rest of them have to go regular. So it really is a way to bind students and minimize, how many schools to which they can apply. And they still find this is a major predictor of yield, that if a kid applies to one of those top schools, Harvard or early, they most likely will attend and matriculate there. ED, early decision, is effectively a binding commitment, and it has to do with you're making a promise. As long as I can afford it, as long as the economics work for my family, I will go to your school if you give me the offer of admission. And so this is it's not like they can't force you to go to their school, but it's an agreement you make, and you make, with the school and, with the high school and the college and so forth. And if the kids begin to break their ED commitments, it becomes problematic between the college and the high school if a lot of their secure kids. But my sister, for example, applied to Penn ED, but then she fell in love with Texas. She went out for a weekend to see a friend and said, "Dad, I'm going to Texas," and she went. And so they called Penn and said, "Hey, guys, we're not coming." And that's it. There's no real recourse. They can't make you come. But it's it's an agreement that's supposed to be singular and binding. Then there's something rolling decision, and rolling is they're filling the class as they go. So I have many of my students, they're getting offers and acceptances as early sometimes as August, September, October. Often they're simpler, often they're state schools. I got the grades, I got the rigor, got testing if that's part of the application, then they give me an answer early. And so the trick of it is, as they fill the class, they fill the class. So what you have a certain profile. I have a 3.9, I have 7 APs, I have, this much activities. I apply. What would have been an acceptance in September becomes a no by December, as they've already filled that class, or they filled the portion, from these regions, these geographies. So you have an advantage by applying early, typically, for rolling admission. And then finally, you have regular decision, which is the standard catch-all. You apply, and ED also, there's ED round 1 and ED round 2 for some schools, ED1, ED2. So like for Penn, like ED1, I had to submit my application by November 1st. But then there's a round called ED2, and often that's the students who don't get their first choice early decision. Then they come back and say, I will bind myself to you again. If you accept me, I'm going later in the game. So I get my letter back, I open my email, it says in December 15th, it says, sorry, you weren't given an offer. I can go and bind myself again to, let's say, Tufts or Vanderbilt or Wake Forest for ED2. And then again, they're going to tell me earlier, but also it's this binding thing. And by binding yourself, you're telling them they have a 1-to-1 lock for yield. If you give me an offer, I'm coming, except for those few, cases where the money doesn't work or whatever things happen. But it's a way for them to control yield management. Because what we'll talk about later, there are so many kids applying to so many more schools that it's getting trickier for colleges to predict who will actually come if given an offer. When kids are applying to not 5 schools, but 15 schools, then they're getting not 3 offers, but 9 offers. It's just trickier. Will we actually enroll this kid or not? But if I apply early decision, I'm telling you I'm coming. If you let me in, like I choose you. And so schools are filling more and more of their classes using early decision. That's something that we are seeing. Let me open my Q&A field over here. And we're going to have a chance. I see some ED questions. What I want to do is go through the deck, but I promise if you load up the questions, I will come back and answer all of them at the end. So let's go ahead and do that. And there is definitely some issues there with affluence and more wealthy families applying early decision, as well as more super high need kids who know they're going to get this big aid packages. But middle class families often are squeezed out of early decision, which is why some critics are saying, why don't we get rid of this? It seems to be favoring more affluent these kids. And there are pressures that are, there's more ED focus than ever before in history. They're trying to manage yield. And there's less information out there as more kids apply without test scores. Test scores actually were really helpful to predict yield. That, kids on a certain score band, if I was way above profile, I had a 1500 on my SAT. Typically, your average student had a 1310. Most likely, I'm going to go to a more selected school. But now, if kids are applying without test scores, they're blind to that. So they really can't predict. Will you come? We don't know. But ED, we know you're going to come. And so they're using it. They're also, using bigger wait lists as well because of all the variability of more kids applying. And there's a much, greater chance of deferring kids or waitlisting or outright denying kids who are actually above profile with all these kids, applying. All right. So here's an example. Barnard last year popped to 62% of the class. They filled early decision, which is crazy. That used to be, it used to be a quarter of kids, a third, but over half. Not Tulane's well over half, Dartmouth. All these schools are popping over, and there's more coming. Penn, Emory, Duke. There's more. They were using this as a major strategy to manage enrollment. Here's one example, just at Boston, BU, that 11 years ago they filled 9% of their class ED, 370 kids. Now they're filling over half of their class ED. So that's one example. It's on the edge. But this trend is happening all over the country. And in Tulane, I heard someone give a talk from Tulane. She said, essentially, we have all these options for kids. We have early decision, 1, binding, ED2, binding, early action, and then regular. But if you apply regular, not that they were insulted, but they're saying, like, do you really want to go here? And so of all of the several thousand kids going to Tulane, only 106 kids came from the regular pool, which is extraordinary. Tulane is really unusual. They're an outlier, but that's an example. I've also seen some stats that were similar from Colorado College, where between ED1, ED2, and early, they let in the absolute lion's share of their class, and they left only the scraps for the regular pool. But again, with the whole issue of affluence and access, there is some challenge there. But that is one example of a school who uses early heavily. All right, and typically there is an advantage, a mathematical numeric advantage for applying early decision especially. We see the numbers of the schools who are super selective, the Browns and Columbias, and essentially it's a 3x factor. So the odds of me getting into one of these schools, regular decision, my odds are a third of getting in early because they fill so much of the class. There is a factor where we have more of the recruited athletes coming early, other diversity admits, students who are being pulled and attracted, and they're being targeted by the schools, so they have something the school wants, so they get in at higher rates. But even the regular well-rounded students, even the straight academic admits, are getting in at higher rates early than they do regular, because the regular pool balloons, and they like early decision. And one of the reasons, one of my colleagues from Penn years ago was a friend I used to sing with in my a cappella group, Tom McManus. He said early decision for Penn was a path paved with gold, because so many of the more affluent kids applied. When you apply early decision, you don't have the option of shopping financial aid offers, which is why you tend to skew towards either, again, more affluent or towards very high need, who then they're going to get massive aid packages. And so they knew they were going to fill the coffers with the early kids, more full pay kids, and then allocate more aid, more need-based aid in the regular pool. So that was the idea of, let's load up on the more affluent students on the front with ED, and then we'll have more resources. And that was something that was, that's not advertised. My friend, we're colleagues and friends, but that's something that schools are definitely aware of. They're trying to manage their discount rate. They need to make a certain amount of tuition money, and they know that ED, they're going to get more full pay kids. They get more full pay from internationals, which is why often, schools like international students, they get more full pay from early decision. And so that's how they help manage their discount rate and so forth. All right, so ED binding, but binding, again, like, you're not bound contractually. They can't force you to come, but it's an agreement you make with them. With binding, that we said there's less room for the bright, well-rounded kids. Schools are looking out for themselves, for their priorities. They're trying to, they have a certain need for first generation kids. They have a certain need for recruited athletes to win games and active in sports. They have a certain need for diversity. They want to have flags in different states. And they're really focusing on their own needs first. Colleges always look out for themselves first. That's what their business is. We know that EA does not carry the same punch as ED. As early action used to be more rare, now it's very popular. So you don't have the same advantage as you used to, let's say, 5 years ago. But ED is still, there's more leverage there. And then early action, that's really about the colleges. It gives the colleges more time to recruit you, to advertise to you. It's about enrollment management for colleges. But it's nice for kids to get a vote of confidence early in the game and open the email, they open the portal and say, congrats, you're in September, October. Kids feel good. They know, I'm going somewhere. At the very, I'm going to this college at least, even if I haven't heard back from my reaches or my likelies, that I have something in my back pocket, which is nice for kids. And so when it comes to this, should I think about this? You're sophomores. So we haven't seen schools yet. But when you're thinking about eventually, in about a year and a half, later, you'll be thinking about this. Do we apply early 1, early 2, single choice? What's really important is, what I've heard people say is, you have one early bullet, single bullet in the gun, and be smart about it. So if I have my grades, I have a 3.8, I have some rigor, don't use your ED bullet for Stanford. It's not going to hit typically. So look at a school where you're at profile or slightly below, but you're close. Tom said, ED can heal the sick, but it can't wake the dead. So if you're not even near their profile in terms of GPA, academic rigor, testing, then apply their regular, take your shot, but don't use your ED bullet, because you have one. It's a single one. Early decision, just you and nowhere else. And so you want to have a good list, be thoughtful and prudent about how you use your early. And then, if you are, in fact, above profile, this is something that we'll talk more about this later. You want to show interest to schools where you're above profile. If I have better grades than the average and better scores, they may think you're just gathering trophies and gathering backups, and they may outright deny you. If you don't show attention, interest to that school. That happens quite a bit. And so we'll talk more about demonstrated interest. But so we'll talk about profile and this kind of things. But academics, your high school transcript matters a heck of a lot. When they ask colleges, what do you care about? What are the things that really matter for you? Grades. Grades in your high school classes are the most important thing, not surprising. And your academic core curriculum is really very important. That's going to be your academic solids, not, your athletics, chorus, those are nice, but your math and your science, history, that's more indicative of how you'll do actually in college. They don't want kids who fail out because that hurts them with their rankings. They want kids who matriculate. They want kids who graduate within 4 and 6 years. And so your performance in high school core classes matters a heck of a lot. Then the next thing after your GPA, your academic rigor. How rigorous of a course selection did you take? Did you push the rigor in your school? Did you to coast and do more on level? Did you go to honors, APs, IB, dual enrollment? So that matters a lot to a lot of schools. After that, we have test scores, which still is meaningful. It's after GPA and rigor, it's next. Things are different now. This data was pre-pandemic, but still test scores are still a factor and still in the 5-pack for what colleges care about. Then you have your essay or writing sample, which is a much lower number if you look at the testing and GPA, because there are schools that don't look at the essay. There are big state schools and, it's more just a numbers game for them. Then you have demonstrated interest below that. There are about 30% of schools don't factor in demonstrated interest. That's like the most selective schools in the country, like the Harvards and the Princetons and Yales. They don't care. They yield at such a high percent that they're not worried. If we give you an offer from Stanford or MIT, you're going to come. And we're not so worried that you actually engage with us in that way, because there's almost no one beyond them in the pecking order. But some of the lower tier schools, mid-tier schools care a lot about demonstrated interest because they know they lose a lot to higher ranked schools. But if you're engaging with them, showing up, going to campus visits, interacting, oh, you're serious about our school. You aren't just gathering your backups. And then you have counselor recs, teacher recs, class rank activities. But look at how far things fall down in terms of very important for activities. It's much, much lower than the academics. The academics are first, and they want kids who are going to graduate, which makes sense. So grades win, the most important thing, period, paragraph. But you have to understand grades in 2023 are not the same as they were when you applied. If you're mostly parents on this call, I applied to school in 93. Things are very different. The number of A's that are given out, there are more of them. And you probably see this with your kids' transcripts. There are more A's and higher A's than ever before. When, graduating with honors or cum laude, that doesn't mean as much as it used to. Or to get honors, it used to be having a 91 meant you have honors. Now it's 97, 98. Those are real numbers for schools in Atlanta, so the private schools here. So it's just so many kids that have A averages. Now I've heard reps from good schools say, well, it's not you have A's, but what kind of A's and in what classes? Not just I have an A's average, because that's not so special when half the kids in the country have an A average. And so that's really kind of amazing, actually. And what's happening is because so many kids have, these super high GPAs, the focus now is more on academic rigor. So rigor is becoming the new GPA. So it's together, it's your academic rigor coupled with your GPA determines your academic standing. Not, I have a 3.9 and 1 AP, like that's not going to do it for so many schools, and so forth. We see that APs have exploded. The AP product is the biggest revenue driver. The College Board is crushing it with the AP product, and there's traction. And also the IB program has been really expanding too, as well as dual enrollment for kids taking college classes, greatly increased. We see the number of students. There were under 1 million 20 years ago. Now there are almost 3 million kids taking AP classes. The number of AP exams keeps increasing. So APs matter, IBs matter, dual enrollment matters. I was totally floored when I saw the stats for UGA. And flagship schools all over the country have become so much more selective. And this has been a trend for about 15 years, where the UVAs and the Michigans and the Texas and the Georgias and the Marylands, they're becoming so much more competitive. It has to do with economics, the cost of college, the debt burden kids are taking on. College is so expensive compared to what it used to be. And so your home school, your flagship school, typically out of state, kids are paying 3x. So in state, it's really a deal. So it's keeping more better students in state. And here in Georgia, we use a merit-based scholarship called the Zell-Miller Scholarship, where you have to have a certain GPA threshold and a certain test score threshold to get the highest scholarship. And if you get it, it's free tuition. So we're talking free tuition versus $48,000 a year tuition. That's a big deal. That's almost $250,000. So we have more smart kids staying local. And so Georgia, when I applied to school, like the kids who could get in nowhere else got into Georgia. It was the backup school. Average test scores were 1,000. It was, GPA high twos. It was, it was not very impressive. Georgia now, I saw this number for the early. This blew my mind. The middle 50%, so the middle half of the class. So that means a quarter of kids have more than this, have between a 4.16 and 4.38 GPA. That's the middle 50%. The middle 50% SAT is required here in Georgia. 1370 to 1510 used to be about 1,000, 1,100. And then the middle 50 percentile of AB, IB dual enrollment was between 8 and 13 classes of advanced either APs, IBs, or dual enrollment. When I was in high school, that wasn't even possible. I mean, I graduated top of my class and I had 7 AP classes. They didn't offer more than 8 or 9. Now kids are taking 15 or 14. It's insane. But just showing you what's happening in terms of how rigor is now replacing GPA as the proxy for are you ready for our college, and how do we compare kids? Because so many kids are applying for the same few spots, they need some metric. If GPA is getting compressed and everyone's kind of piling up at the end, then the next thing is rigor. And if testing becomes optional, then even more so, because testing was one means of discriminating between the highest kids and the middle kids and the lower kids. But and testing still is a factor, but for the schools who are selective, it's getting very bunched up with test optional and with grade compression. So that's kind of the state we're in, and why there's more anxiety. Why I get it. This is a new world, different than it was when you applied to school. So grade trends, they matter a lot. Talking to students, your sophomores. Sophomore year matters. The biggest show, the big year, is junior year. Even more important than sophomore or freshman. Junior year is when you're taking the more advanced classes, and performance in college level classes really matters a lot. It's the best predictor of are you ready for college. Your freshman grades, they're a predictor, but your junior year grades matter more. So getting C's as a freshman, easier to forgive. Getting C's when you're a junior, more challenging, because typically when kids are applying early in October, the last real grades you have are your junior year. So if you have a really soft junior year, that's tough. That's grade trend. So you have a 3.5 GPA can mean different things. 3.5 means I started off so strong as a freshman and I began to fall apart as I went through. That's a trend that scares them. They're worried you get to college and you're on probation and you fail out. Getting a 3.5, steady, but a trend they even like even more is a late bloomer. You start off a little bit softer freshman year, stronger sophomore, really strong junior, and then you're just crushing it. That's a nice trend if schools see that. So, he's showing you that trends matter. So rigor matters, trends matter. And then this is balancing act of balancing rigor and GPA. Because again, having a 3.9 with no rigor, no one cares. I mean, that won't get you into any school. That's mildly selective. But having a 3.2 with a ton of rigor, that's tough too. There's a balancing act here of you want to optimize, it's, the lever of I need rigor and I need GPA. And I don't want to push too hard. I don't want to push and get to my APs or dual enrollment classes and get C's. Those are tougher. That means I probably push too hard. C is not performing. It's better to stay in an honors class and get a B or an A than push into an AP and get a C. But in schools that are more selective, they want to see A's and more A's than B's in your advanced classes. So as schools get more selective, they want to see academic rigor plus performance because they can be that picky because they have so many kids applying. When you're comparing yourself within the cohort of your school. So every time you send an application, you're going to have a school profile attached showing, the school offering, number of APs, average performance, how many kids get 4s and 5s and 3s, what's expected. Typically, our kids take 3 APs or 7 APs. I've given talks up at Stuyvesant and other, where kids take on average 11 APs, or it's very different than I'm in a school with some schools don't offer APs. And so it depends on the school you're looking at. And so that you're being compared to your cohort. So what's, not compared to other people, it's looking at your school, how you did vis-a-vis what was available to you. Also the comparisons, within gender comparisons, within ethnic bands. Right now, they may outlaw affirmative action. That may not be a thing after SCOTUS rules, and they're going to hand down the ruling in June with a North Carolina, UNC and the Harvard cases in SCOTUS. But right now, they are looking at you vis-a-vis your peer group, so the micro peer group. So if females are a stronger cohort, which in fact they are, in terms of course taking, they take more rigorous courses and get higher GPAs. So, and when schools are trying to maintain a somewhat of a gender balance of guys and girls, if the female cohort's stronger, it's going to be stronger for the females. It's going to be harder on average for a female student. So a female student may need a little higher GPA, a little more academic rigor than a guy, because the cohorts have differences. And same thing with different ethnicity groups and so forth. So you're kind of competing within these smaller levels. The bottom line is you want to take the hardest classes that you can do well in. You don't want to push rigor so much you blow your GPA. And don't think there's a balancing. Again, there's a balancing act, looking at your core academic classes and trying to maintain the core even more than the music or other things that are not as critical to colleges as your core GPA. Activities, they matter. The video games count? Probably not, unless one of my students is this year at Northeastern doing esports. So he is an amazing gamer, and he's actually going to be part of the team and the competition. So and they recruit certain schools, kind of crazy. But typically, no, your video games aren't that. They're looking for things where you have continuity over time, depth of commitment, and contribution. So they want to see you've done something, one or two things for multiple years, and you've shown some leadership. You can get your leadership either in school or out of school. I didn't have much leadership in school. I wasn't a peer leader. I wasn't student body, but I was involved in my youth group outside. I was the president of a youth group. There are things you can do to show you have leadership and you also have commitment. When you fill out the Common App, you fill out how many hours a week, a month, a year to do the activity, and having a bunch of things. An hour a month, they don't really care. I'm part of 15 groups. They don't care, but I'm part of these two things. I did them with continuity, and I rose, and I had accomplishments and achievements. They're trying to figure out, what are you going to bring to our campus? What contributions will you make? Are you going to sample everything, or are you going to be leading or contributing? Like for me, my thing was music, and I was very involved with a cappella and the quartet and the octet and troubadours and our musical theater. And so when I went to Penn, I was involved with musical theater. So that was my thing. So everything. Some kids are into robotics. Some kids are huge into community service. They have 1,000 hours of service. Their school requires 150. They're going to come to that college and be the service person. So they're going to contribute in that way. So they're trying to figure out, what are you going to bring us? Not just, I've done a bunch of stuff. I'm a bright, well-rounded kid. They want to see you've put some investment in maybe one area or two areas. All right, DI, demonstrated interests. Why do you show up? Why do you go on the college tours? Why do you go to the college fairs? Well, they're going to be tracking level of many schools. 70% look at this. 30% don't care about this. They want to show is their contact. Are you actually giving some love to the school? High contact. You might do an interview when you go to the campus, or an alumni interview. You may do a visit. You may show up and do a recruiting event. You may talk to a faculty member. Medium, you may do a campus tour, info session. You may show up when they come to your high school. You may go to a college fair. Low, you're not doing much. And they can rank students on high or low, because again, they're trying to figure out enrollment management. If we give you an offer, will you actually matriculate? Will we actually yield you? And for the kids who have very little engagement, they could be applying to 20 schools in the Common App, and then they're probably not going to your school. So that's where, if you're above profile but don't show any love to the school, they may think you aren't serious and ding you and deny you, even though you're above profile. So that's where engagement matters. And even there's even ways. The slide's kind of old now. I've been doing this for a long time, but even like 5-6 years ago, they're looking at the electronic footprints. That every time they send you an email, there's a digital beacon, a single invisible pixel, which pings back to the server, which everyone uses for open rates, engagement. If you click on something, it tracks exactly where you go, what you click on the site, how long you spend there, and they can quantify all of this. So they're observing, they're seeing how you engage with them, both in person and digitally. Colleges now are using this system called Slate. Hundreds and hundreds of colleges, almost all the ones who you know of who are selective, use this, and they can track and measure online behavior without any effort on their own. It just gives you a score, and this shows you activity. Went to an event, sent an email, receive an email, open an email, click an email. They have all this stuff and they can score you, bam. And so, okay, digital engagement, 35, or whatever their system is. So they're observing how you're interacting with them, both analog and digitally. So DI, tour the schools. Virtual tours are now the thing after the pandemic, and they're very popular, and sometimes they've gotten better. But make sure if you do a virtual tour, you interact, because they can evaluate if you're interacting in a virtual way or if you just turned it on and walk away for 2 hours. Do your homework, be ready to engage, open emails, and so forth. Make sure you have an appropriate email address for them. Make sure you're smart with your kids' social media. It's appropriate. And top schools who are very selective, the Ivies or the MITs, they don't care about this because, again, they matriculate almost so many of their kids. There are some schools like Drexel matriculates 8% of their students, so they have to give out 12 offers to yield one kid. But that's going to be in the 60s or 70s for the Ivies and MITs. So they aren't so worried that kids will turn down MIT or Princeton or so forth. Also, there's going to be some showing interest within the application itself. They're going to ask you, why do you want to go to a school? That's very common. You have the essay supplements beyond the Common App personal statement. Why Barnard? And that's where you have to have had some time. That's where a visit can really help blow it open, and you write about your experience and your feelings and your conversations and what a great fit, versus giving them back their brochure, which they don't want. And then why that, why us, what interest do you plan to pursue? So again, showing some that you put in some time. Major selections, that was one for USC and so forth. Okay. Interviews, they're out there. They matter a little bit more than they used to, since so many schools are test optional. That was something that we saw that when Wake Forest went test optional, they began to require an interview. That's very rare. It's very labor intensive and resource intensive for the school, especially in this age of hyper application, the inflation. But when you do an interview with an alum, it counts less than when you do it with someone from the admissions office. But not all schools make this available as an option. But they may, because now everyone has a Zoom, a cell phone, they may put a little more weight. There's still, it's kind of the black box of how much weight schools put on this. I have a number of colleagues and friends to do the alumni interviews, and it's pretty basic. It's kind of, did you show up? Were you cordial? They don't have much say or much leverage, the alumni. But people in the admissions committee, when they're reading your application, they think, oh yeah, I remember that kid. And and whenever you do an interview, go with questions you ask them, engage with them, and always write a thank you note. Email's great. Okay. And then thinking about applying and thinking about diversity. Sometimes parents don't realize that diversity has different meanings, even if you're not a underrepresented minority student. You still may be diverse in certain ways in certain places. And that's something where, like, if I'm applying to University of Chicago, it's going to be a little bit tougher for me if I'm applying from Evanston, if I'm applying from the North Shore, than if I was applying to Chicago from, let's say, Wyoming, because I'm more diverse. They get a lot of applications from certain demographies. Actually, I applied to Penn. It was easier getting into Penn from Atlanta than if I was in the tri-state area. They have a lot more kids applying from Jersey and New York and Connecticut. And then, if I was applying from, again, Florida, Georgia, or Alabama. So even, my GPA and my rigor might get me in from Atlanta, but not get me in if I'm in Manhattan. So it's understanding, because they're trying to make a balance. They're not going to give away every single seat. The kids, even if they have better grades and better scores, or they want flags in every single state. And the same thing, like for a state school, like for UGA. It's going to be, I can get in to Georgia from, let's say, Moultrie or Lumpkin County or a smaller rural county than I could from DeKalb County or Fulton County, where my competitive set is just higher here. I'm competing against these kids versus I'm applying from Moultrie. There aren't that many kids with strong, my level of academic rigor or grades or test scores. So again, it's thinking about diversity on a broader scale in terms of what you bring. And also they're looking at gender balance, ethnic, racial balance, and geographic balance. So that's kind of thinking more broadly about diversity. A few slides about finances. A lot of schools, and begin doing this, don't be so scared when you see the sticker price. The world we live in is called the high tuition, high discount model, where their tuition keeps raising. And there is a small sliver of folks who are paying full boat for so affluent they're not going to be eligible for any kind of financial aid. But the majority of schools out there, a lot of their kids are getting pretty steep discounts. So they keep raising the tuition because the less price sensitive, more affluent are going to pay it. But the majority of kids are getting very strong discounts. The average discount for a private school at a first year is 45%. So that means if tuition is $60,000, on average, people are paying only 55% of that. So be mindful of that. Don't be so scared. And then 3/4 of schools use merit aid. So even if you're not need-based, they're allocating money to try to enroll kids using merit scholarships. And this is just, it optimizes revenue. You know, the affluent are less price sensitive. They're going to pay that full thing, which keeps rising every year. But the middle class, they're really getting more reliant upon merit-based aid. And then the lower income families are going to get pretty generous aid packages typically. Which is why, more of them, this is kind of the game we're in. There are some schools going back to flat pricing. And it started off, there was, not Smith. There was a school in the Southeast where they were fiscally in trouble, and they said, forget this high tuition discount. We're doing a flat pricing model, and more kids began to apply. And then their sales pitch became value, that we're $30,000, but no haggle pricing. We're $30,000 for everyone. We're not 65 for you, 40 for you, 20 for you, 10 for you. This is our price. And then more kids, okay, that's actually more reasonable, and more kids apply because they weren't scared by that top number. If you want to find out more about the pricing, you type in the word net price calculator, NPC, for schools. And colleges are required by Congress if they get financial aid, that they have this on the website. Some of them it's on page 1, and you type in, here's my average income, $140,000 on average. With someone with my income, they get this discount, this through grant, this through need, this through merit, XYZ. They say, so even though your cost of attendance is going to be this, and the net family contribution is going to be here, or the EFC, your estimated family contribution. So look at the net price calculators, understand the model, and so forth. But merit money is real. Merit money is a big deal. And even if the tuition is 50, they may throw a merit award at you, or a grant of 15,000. So now it's 35. That's meaningful. And even if I can't get any financial need-based aid, I get some merit-based aid. And more they realize also, if we get really, really strong students, they're going to become really, really strong alum, and they may become more generous over time, and maybe they'll endow a wing down the road. And so colleges are using this. They're using merit money, merit aid to have a stronger class. One example I always refer to is Alabama. You would not believe how academically strong they've gotten. They used to be a joke too. They used to be a total backup school. They've given out over $110 million in merit-based aid. They keep giving so much aid. And their freshman class it's nuts. How many kids have 3 9s, 4 O's, the average test score, it's up in the 29s, it's like 30, 31. It's amazing how Alabama, and 40% of their kids come out of state now, and they're pulling kids who are getting into Brown. They're going to Bama because it's free. And their parents do the math like, I could spend $250,000 up at Brown, or go to Alabama, tuition's free, and then go back to grad school and spend money. And so it's interesting looking at this balancing act. My sister did that at Texas. She went to Texas. She applied to Penn, went to UT instead. She got in-state tuition at Texas, which was back then was $5,000 a year. And so she did, in 3 years, she got her degree for nothing. And then she went to Duke and got in Harvard and everywhere else. So part of it is you can go, the money is all in undergrad. If you want a good package financially, undergrads, that's where they're giving the biggest, award packages, less so for kids getting master's and doctoral degrees. The best deals come from the schools for the undergraduates. So, but Alabama, my sister-in-law, her kids, her daughter applied to a bunch of schools. One of them applied to Tulane, applied to Alabama, applied to South Carolina, applied to Virginia. And she got a 1390 on the SAT. She had good grades, and that 1390 that put her in the UA Scholar bucket, which meant tuition went from $30,000 a year down to $6,000 a year, a net savings of $96,000. That's compelling. She ended up going to South Carolina, but the fact that she was offered $100,000 for her test score and her grades, that's compelling. It's called a merit-based scholarship, not tied to need, tied to merit. So a few trends, and I I think I have too many slides, which I always do, but I'm going to shift eventually to answer questions. It'll probably 10 till, even though, no matter where I'm at here. But applications, they're way up. They're way up. Perceived scarcity is making more kids apply to more schools. It's a self-reinforcing feedback loop. And then the question is 20 the new 10? Normally it's, and in some kids, what they're doing is they're applying to 10 schools, the one they would apply to with their foundation schools, their likely schools in their reach. But then they have 10 schools, the super reaches. And it's like, why not? It says a few more dollars. Why don't I apply to Princeton and MIT? And like, who cares? Because part of it, people are being lured in because they're test optional. And oftentimes what would keep kids from applying to those schools was their testing threshold. I needed a 34 or a 35 to be competitive for Yale. Or now it's optional. Well, why not? Why shouldn't I apply to Yale? I have a 3.9. And so you have more kids applying, which means these schools are getting more selective and it's getting more ridiculous. And so the Common App is showing that the more kids are applying, applications are up 5.6 per student, but some kids are applying to 1 or 2, and some kids are applying 10, 11, 15, I've heard, even 20, which is too many. If you're applying to 20 schools, you haven't done enough homework on the front. I think 10 in my mind should be the cohort, should be the threshold. And you shouldn't just apply to every Ivy. They're so different. You should apply to maybe 1 or 2 that fit you, and then apply to college schools and likely schools and like your core schools. So volume is up. There's definitely a surge at the very selective schools. And and the challenge is, after George Floyd and other things, and diversity, equity, inclusion stuff, they're trying to make more spots for kids from less privileged backgrounds, but they have a fixed number of spots. And so if you look at the spots going to internationals, which has been on the increase for decades, more international kids, full pay kids, more high need first gen diversity students, then how many spots are left? And it's a smaller number. So kids feel compelled to apply to more schools, and it makes it more selective. It's kind of a crazy cycle. But here we see some of the numbers. I mean, when I applied to Penn, it was like 30% plus acceptance rate. So many schools, it's bizarre. Duke used to be, like 25, 30%. Now it's 4.5%. Like, what is that? I mean, it's kind of wild. And this is just the pandemic effects. And a lot of this has to do with going test optional. When schools are optional, the cork's off, and then everyone's applying. So that's part of the change. Northeastern has exploded 6.7%. They used to be 40% and 50%. I remember that. So anyhow, then testing. Let's pivot, because testing is part of the conversation. We'll talk about test optional, what it all means, and what it doesn't mean. So when you're looking at testing your sophomores, it's next year. It's all for next year, but save it, put it in your, lodged away in your brain. These tests overlap about 80%. Know that. They're very, very similar. There are some different, they're structurally very similar in how they line up, big passages, timing is similar. The ACT is a faster, speedier test. Know that, remember that. The SAT is less speedy. ACT is more about processing speed. How fast can I move? You have to move. You get 40% more time on the SAT for similar questions. So be mindful of that. ACT, they were going to change a few things, computer-based testing, but that's all currently on hold. They do automatically generate a super score. So if I take 3 ACTs, they're going to put together my best sectional scores for my different sittings. So here's an example. So in March, my best score was a 670 in math. Then May, I had a flat test. June, I scored a 660. Well, my super score is my 670 math and my 660 verbal together is my 1330. Even though I never scored more than a 1310, my super score is my best altogether. Now, you're sophomores. So your kids are going to see the first digital SAT in history. That's going to be your kids. And so it's coming. These are more secure. Results come faster. Their tests are more efficient. They're going to have more tests during the school day. And so they'll always have their calculator from now on. The scoring won't change. The timing of it, it's 2 hours and 24 minutes. That's a short test. And kids are going to like this test because it's much shorter. That's a big deal. And you have more time per question. So you have fewer questions and more time, and you have a shorter duration. There's a lot of reasons why kids are going to like this test. Here's a structure. It's a reading module that's baseline, then a reading adaptive module, take 10-minute break, a math baseline module, a math adaptive, then a little break, then you're finished. It's 2 hours and a quarter, 224. So then the timing, it's crazy how much more time you have. On the digital SAT, you have 71 seconds per question for verbal versus 44. On the math, you have 95 seconds per question versus a minute. That's a 60% increase in time for the SAT versus the ACT. That is profound. And so I think a lot of kids are going to really like this new test. I've taken it several times and I'm a fan. Adaptive mean, with that, and we'll do more of this. You're only sophomores, but we'll talk more about this next year. That you start off with a baseline test everyone takes, and then based on performance, you'll be filtered into a more easy or more difficult second section. So it looks like this. I get a baseline math. If I get about 2/3 right, I go to the harder math section with harder questions. If I get under 2/3 right, I go to the easier with easier questions. Same thing with verbal. And so timing of this, it's actually happening internationally in March. So we have about 6 weeks, and our kids overseas are taking the first ever digital SAT. And that's required. The paper goes away essentially, except for if you have an accommodation and a disability. And so there'll be a PSAT in October, and 9 months from now, and then for your kids in March, they're going to have the digital SAT. So the data suggests that 80% of students who had taken a paper test like the computer one better. And administrators seem to like it too. It's simpler, it's quicker. There are no forms, no scantrons. It's all on your own device. That's nifty. You also have shorter passages. You're going away from 10 question, 90 sentence, 90 line passages down to one paragraph, one question, next, one paragraph, one question. So reading, there's less of a burden on working memory. You get results back in days, not weeks. All this good stuff. So what does that mean for you? When it comes to the SAT and the ACT, you got to figure out, not now, but next year, are you going to go with the SAT or the ACT? Ideally, you're going to start with your strength, and at Applerouth will help you get a baseline test if you want for the baseline SAT, baseline ACT. Then if you're more than 70 points better on one on the scale of the SAT, go with that test. If you're within the range of indifference, if you score a 1200 on the SAT and a 26 ACT, you're in that range of indifference, then go with student preference. I like this one better. Great, that's our test. And then most of our kids, we recommend taking it 3 times because schools are going to super score and they'll cherry pick your best sectional scores. That's really helpful. And then testing tends to be as a junior. And so if you're only, a sophomore, I would say you're totally fine to wait. Though, but if you're currently a sophomore and you want to do a paper test, well, paper goes away in March. So that means you may want to be thinking about this for the August SAT or the October or November or December tests. So, which may mean you want to do some of your preparation this summer. You still have an extra, you have 5 months. But typically when you finish sophomore year, that's when the lane opens up for testing for kids. There is a question, should I wait? Will I get smarter at this when I'm older? And the answer is no. Typically, things are capping sophomore year, like math, and junior year. Algebra 2 is where the math ends, and you're on to pre-cal, which is not relevant to the SAT and calculus. And so your math is peaked, and the grammar is the same as it was in 8th grade. The reading, some kids are advanced readers. They're good to go when they start junior year. But typically we find that students who take their third test, whether it's early junior year or as seniors, there really is no difference. There is no summer growth. So kids who start early tend to, versus waiting until you're a senior, we recommend starting when sophomore year ends, you're good to go. In most cases, assuming you've had Algebra 2, if you're in Algebra 2, you should look at your first test as March of junior year. Because Algebra 2 is important on both tests. Okay, and then we got that. Okay, let me go over. So test optional. Let me do this in 2 minutes, then open for questions. We have required, optional, flexible, and blind. The world is test optional for the most part, but test optional does not mean test blind. A good test score can factor and help you. So 1,830 plus colleges are optional. About 85 schools are blind. And the over 1,400 schools have made the choice to stay permanently optional or blind. And so we're going to see some crawling back toward test required, but the majority of schools are going to be optional probably for going forward. And so blind is going to be a small portion, about 5-10% of the 2,500 four-year schools. And so the majority, again, are going to be optional. And so test optional, what it did is it made schools more selective. I showed you the slide before. That's being driven by optional admissions. Common App submission rates show that submission rates are definitely down. But at schools that are more selective, they aren't down nearly as much. Schools who are highly selective, about 2/3 of kids are applying with test scores to those top selected schools. And for the non-first gen applicants. And then there are also different rates of score submission by major. That kids applying to STEM programs, engineering, science, math, computer science, they tend to submit their scores at higher rates to showcase their math scores. Gen Ed, other educations, they tend to submit at lower rates because it's not as important. So kids showing off their math scores are the ones who are tending to send their test scores. There's also this new thing we're seeing of conditional optional. Auburn did this, that they encourage test scores. It's very clear that if you have a 3.6 GPA, then you're optional. If you have a 3.5 or a 3.58 and below, we want to see a test score. So that's something we're seeing more schools playing with. It's conditional test optional. And also test flexible, that if students have a bunch of really strong APs or IBs, then that can sometimes stand instead of a test score. That we've heard from admissions officers, if you don't have a test score, I'm going to look more closely at your APs and other things. Anything that's standardized becomes more important if you can't give me a test score. And so, kids are better off if they have at least a test score, because colleges can change their policies mid-year. You might think, oh, we're good. Like Purdue announced like months ago, 2 months ago, yeah, now we're back test required. And that can happen on a dime. And so MIT, now we're back test required. And it's probably going to happen to some more schools in the South. Alabama could go back, Virginia can go back, Carolina, they teased it and said, wait another 2 years. Texas teased it and went back on it. And so if you're applying to some of these in Michigan might go. So in the grand scheme of things, it's good to have a test score just in case a school flips on you, whether you submit it or not. It's more submission optional, but I think having a test score can help you. And these rates of submission are still in flux. We still don't know how it's going to tease out once the dust all settles. We do know that without test scores, it's a little bit harder for colleges to predict who's going to enroll and persist. It's harder for students trying to figure out, am I competitive? Because the new score ranges are different because we've shaved off the bottom like quarter of kids with low test scores. So that's skewing ranges to the right. There's a question of, did Samirs have an edge? Boston College tells you a story that kids with test scores were accepted at a rate of 29%. Kids without test scores were accepted at a rate of 11%. That's extreme, that's an outlier. But here's your schools, which I went through this list myself, and I found this on their websites. It's not public data. They don't publish it typically, but we're able to back this out looking at with their press releases. UVA admits kids with test scores at 26%, without 14%. Notre Dame, 22 to 11. But BC, 29 to 11. Tufts, 13 to 9. Barnard, 10 to 6. Wellesley, 17 to 9. Emory, 17 to 9. Colgate, 25 to 12. Vanderbilt, 7 to 6. So there is an advantage at most schools. There's also the issue of collinearity, that kids with test scores have good test scores, and they tend to have also good grades and good rigor. So it's not but then when you have two kids applying with very similar GPAs, similar course taking, one submits a 33, one has no testing, that 33 becomes part of the conversation. So it definitely does factor. Do you want to send it in? Well, about half of kids are sending test scores in, more males than females because of the whole STEM difference I mentioned earlier. It's more strategic, where kids are applying, they're sending their scores to these 5 schools, not to these 5 schools. So I know that my 33 is not great at Yale. My 33 is great at Georgia. Bam. So it's like I'm Tulane, maybe, but South Carolina, definitely. So it's understanding, where does my score help, where hurt, and then you do the calculus, looking at the score ranges. A strong score could help offset, lighter grades or rigor, and just being mindful of all these things. Let me And also, if you have like embedded in I have my score is like 1350. It's below their middle 50%, but I have a very strong math score in there. I have a 780 in math. Sometimes you want to send that if you're going to be a math major or a science major or a computer science major and so forth, and treat every school uniquely. And then STEM matters more. That's Jeff Stelling, an author, said, yeah, for STEM kids, testing will be more important. Look at the school, look at the rank. If you're in the lower part of this, below the middle 50 percentile, I probably wouldn't send it unless you really wanted to see it in most cases. And yeah, and Rick Clark from Tech said, yeah, if you're in the middle 50, you're up. But if you're in the bottom, it depends. If you're in the bottom quarter, I probably wouldn't send it according to Rick. Like Swarthmore, here's an example. So their mid 50 is 1380 to 1540. Top half, send it. Bottom quartile, probably not. That third quartile depends. If I have amazing grades, I have a 3.9 unweighted, a bunch of rigor, a bunch of APs, and then my test scores are 1390, I probably wouldn't send it. If I have a 3.5 or 3.6 and a 1450, and I only have a couple of APs, I probably send it. So this is balancing act. Or if there is a 790 math in there, and I'm applying to be an engineer, send it. That's part of the balancing act. We also know that score ranges are higher now than they were before the pandemic. But Georgia actually is test required again. But you can see during the optional year, look how much everything went up. Their scores went hard right because kids with weak scores didn't send them. And so look at their middle 50 for the ACT, but now it's still elevated, but not what it was. We can see BU, they also had some up creep after, now that they're optional and so forth. And here we see other schools, Emory, Colgate, Davidson. There was some shift to the right after test optional. We saw that. All right. And then, so if you're a freshman, you pass that, you're sophomore. Grades are the big deal right now. Take appropriate grades. The PSAT was practice, join a club, get involved with something that you care about. This summer, do something, at least one thing that can go on the transcript, whether it's, a summer camp or an internship. Don't just play video games. And then you'll also be the first class to take the digital SAT. Next year, it's the hardest year. It's the most important year academically, balancing academic rigor and challenge. Activities, you'll be looking at financial aid, doing some college visits. Next year is a big year for exploration and research, but this year really just keep the grades strong, do at least one activity and use the summer and be smart. And then some of you will do some test prep this summer, getting ready for the junior year and the shift from paper to digital. And then when you're a senior, they're going to be applying in October and applying in November, and then you get your answers back. You give your deposit in May and then off to college. So Applerouth Tutoring, we do three things: academic tutoring, test preparation, and EF coaching. We help kids get organized. We have a quick poll. Just Peter, if you could drop that. And it takes all of 10 seconds. I'm going to share something with you here. And it should be coming any second now. There we go. If you wouldn't mind just filling this in, and then I'm going to go to Q&A. We already have questions lined up. Are you a student, a parent? Kind of who are you? Where you are in the cycle, and if we can help in any way. And if you want, do you want someone to reach out to you? We can definitely do that for you. That's what you do. So go ahead and fill that out, and let me go and open up Q&A window and start with questions and answers. Okay, here we go. And feel free, as something comes up, go ahead and type it in, and I will answer all of these. All right. Does early decision favor wealthy families because students aren't given a chance to compare financial aid packages? The answer is yes. So again, it's somewhat of a dumbbell, kind of bimodal. You have more affluent kids applying who aren't shopping offers, and you have more low-income kids applying. We're going to get a very sweet package. But the middle class, they need a good package. And that's one of the reasons why many of them don't apply ED. So the answer, that's part of it, why it definitely favors the affluent applicants. When do you start applying ED? You apply early decision. The deadlines, typically, you see a November 1st deadline is very common. Some of them, November 15th deadline, that's ED round 1. ED 2 was going to hit in January after you get your answers back in December. For what it's worth, my daughter's best friend applied early to Duke, got in, waited to see where else she was accepted, told Duke, sorry, too expensive, and went to Stanford without aid. Well, Stanford's one of the top schools in the country. Is it happening a lot? It happens because again, they can't make you go anywhere. You're doing a contract you sign with your school, but they can't force you to go anywhere. It's your choice. So it definitely does happen. If you get in to a higher level, more attractive. Yeah, Stanford does trump Duke for nationally there. So I totally get that choice. Are merit scholarships announced with early decision? How common are merit-based scholarships? So when you get your acceptance, following your acceptance, they're going to send you your financial aid, your offer letter in terms of what they're going to give you. So it comes several days later. They're going to give you the offer letter. So you're accepted, and then soon thereafter, we're giving you this grant, we're giving you this work study opportunity, we're giving you this need-based thing, merit-based thing. And merit-based scholarships are very, very, very common. Like the Ivies don't give merit-based scholarships. Everyone would get them. All their kids are, so very, very bright. But especially mid-level schools, I mentioned, like the flagship schools, the state schools, they definitely give lots of merit scholarships. Even Tulane, my niece applied and got a merit-based scholarship to Tulane that was substantial. It was like $15,000 a year, and it was not need-based, it was merit-based. So definitely many schools do. You have to go on their websites, talk with the reps, find out what thresholds for grades. Some of them, like the Jefferson, there's going to be an interview or going to be an essay you have to write, but definitely they're very prominent. What's the best way to determine the ED profile of the school? By profile, you want to look at, they're going to tell you the incoming freshman class averages, the school profile. They're going to tell you on average our GPA. There's also something called the Common Data Set, CDS. You type in Tulane Common Data Set 2022, and you'll see how many kids came in early decision, how many kids had test scores, how many kids applied with what grades. So Common Data Set, I look at it all the time. It's very, very helpful. Okay. How much do AP test scores matter versus taking the AP classes? So the scores themselves, if you have a bunch of good scores, you send them. They're not required. But if I have a bunch of 4s and 5s, it's impressive. So they're definitely a plus factor. But what's more important is getting the grades in the classes. If I have 70s in my AP classes and I get a 5, that 70 kills me. Even though the 5 is amazing, that really is more for placement and for buying an elective or graduating early. But it is it's part of the in committee. They'll say, all right, kid has 3.8 GPA, 7 APs, got a pair of 5s on physics and math, on BC calculus. They're going to go. It's part of the conversation if you have impressive results. But the GPA matters more. If the GPA is weak, that trumps the heck out of strong performance on the actual exams. With all the buzz on kids' mental health, are colleges taking that into account and putting emphasis on being well-rounded rather than just grades? Unfortunately, no. The bright, well-rounded kids, because I think about this from the perspective of an admissions officer. I heard this from Duke, the head of Duke admission, and he said, you know what, we used to read and we get 12,000 kids applying for 4,000 spots, 3,500 spots. That was great. They could read as more leisurely. Then the number bumped to 25,000. Now it's 49,000 kids applying for the same 3,000, 2,000 spots. How the heck can we evaluate them? We need something measurable, something that's easy to measure. We need numbers, like measuring someone by being well-rounded versus you have all these kids applying for these scarce spots. We're going to evaluate you on numbers. By numbers are always first, right? The GPA, the academic rigor, testing is part of it too. But being bright and well-rounded for these super selective schools, not really, unfortunately. I wish it were the case, but it's just the numbers are just crazy because of scarcity. Will the new SAT scores be given instantly? No, they're going to wait a bit, but eventually it's going to be a matter of days, not weeks. I promise. But in the beginning, they'll probably want to look at it, vet it, and look for anomalies, run data. So I think the March test will probably be, I'm sure, a couple of weeks, but then eventually they said within a few days. Like the GRE and GMAT, they tell you instantly, but they're not saying that's coming yet. Does the PSAT score matter? No. The PSAT score does not matter. For national merit, it's not for college admission. College never see that PSAT score. The National Merit Scholarship Corporation, 50,000 kids in the country of the 2 million takers are going to get something, they'll be in the running. Then you have the like semifinalists. That's about 16,000 and finalists. And then I think it's 16,000 finalists. Then the people who actually finish it, they get their confirming score. They do the write the essay. That's around 8,000 kids out of 3 million high school graduates. So it's a sliver of a sliver. So, and if you have good test scores, you get paid for that. There are some schools who they like bragging. We have 35 National Merit Scholars or whatever it is. But those kids are going to have really strong test scores anyhow. Will be eligible for aid, merit-based aid for the schools who offer it. Should I use ED on dream colleges or swing for the fence? I would use ED where you're slightly below profile. I wouldn't blow it. If I have a 3.7 and I have 5 APs, don't apply to MIT with your ED. It's not going to happen unless you wrote 5 books in your first gen college and something super special. You have one bullet, use it carefully, thoughtfully. So don't blow it on a school that's where you're way below profile. That's what I've heard so many admissions officers and people say, admissions counselors rather. My wife and I both went to competitive schools, but I disagreed about the need for a coach or counselor. Like you, I went to Penn and we never heard of it and didn't do it. Is it worth the investment? It depends. Do you need an IEC? No. And it depends also on the level of resources at your high school. Like I went to Pace Academy. Now they have like 3 or 4 full-time missions, counselors for 100 kids per class. You're getting an IEC. So you're with that tuition, that 30 grand you're paying for it. So, but if I go to a school where they have every counselor has 150 kids and I'll do maybe one meeting, then maybe I'm when I'm saving on tuition, I may pay 4 grand, 5 grand, 7 grand, depending on where you live, for an IEC. And also looking at, do you want to do more of the work? Do you feel like your kid's going to work with you, research with you? You could go and get some essay help. It depends. So does everyone need an IEC? No. But I definitely see students who are really undecided. They haven't really cast the net. They haven't heard of many schools. They don't know a darn thing. Like I know the schools in my region. I know Vandy. I know USC. I know Carolina. I know Tech and Barry, but I have an idea about Oberlin. I don't know the first thing about Bates or Bowdoin or, looking at expanding the Kenyon. There are schools out there that could be really, really cool that maybe you don't hear about. And maybe your cohort didn't talk about. So I think they're going to expand the conversation. They'll talk about if there's a disability, if there's some athletic-based coaches looking at athletes, so I think there's a rationale for it. But if you start doing the research and the work, if you can get really involved, your kids involved, you obviously can do it yourself. But so it depends kind of answer. So does everyone need it? No. There's some benefit without question. And if you want a referral, I can give you 5 names. You can call 5 names. We work with IECs all the time, and many of them are exceptional. Some of them have actually been on the other side of the desk. They've actually worked on the admissions offices, and they know a good essay, they know a good profile, and they can coach you on where and how to use your energy and resources. So I think there's definitely a reason for them. And I'm a fan. And so if you want more support there, let us know. We're happy to give you contacts in your area or online. Okay. Anything else, y'all? It is, what do we got? 9:08. I'm here. Any last questions? And if there are questions about the digital SAT, we'll be talking a lot more about that. I know it's still very new, but we're going to be doing full webinars. I'll be giving several. We're currently writing our own tests. We're very deep in that right now. And we're ready for when that comes along. All right, y'all. I don't see any more questions. I see one more. Are IECs the same as college planners? Yes. College, it's independent ed consultants. I say IEC. Same as independent college counselors, independent college planners. There's a college like financial planners who help you with financial planning. They're different than an IEC. The independent ed consultant. Are you getting a copy of the recording? Definitely. We're going to send you a copy of the recording. Feel free to watch it again, and then we'll be doing more of these over the course of the, we do a lot of these talks, and they're free. So, and if you need help in any way, there's one more. If a student wants to take pre-med, must they take AP US? No, you don't have to have a push. If you want me pre-med, I probably want to have a coherent narrative. So I probably like to have some good sciences, some good math in there. Showcase, I'm ready for more rigorous science kind of classes. I would love an AP Bio or a physics in there if I'm looking at, but AP US, if you're in honors, that's okay too. And pre-med, what really matters eventually is going to be how you do in organic chemistry and gen chem and physics in college. But so you definitely do not need AP for pre-med. You mentioned at least 8 APs, 4 junior, 4 senior. It depends, and 8 depending on the school. And like for Georgia, yeah, some mix. It could be you took AP World as a sophomore. It could be you took chemistry as a sophomore. It could be you do stat or environmental science. It could be they have a new one. They have now pre-cal. There's now African American history. There's all these computer science principles. There are a bunch, but you could break it up. I've seen some kids do 5 and then doing the right balance. You don't want to blow GPA. Make sure and also mental health. Don't make the kids nuts. Make sure it's a good fit for your student. Don't just chase a number. Some schools don't need 8. I'm saying as Georgia for the early kids, 8 to 13 is the average. But then again, a fourth of the kids have less than that, and that's the early kids. All right, y'all. I think that's it. Do you have to do college and high school classes? That's the same. So that's an AP is like an IB, International Baccalaureate. Dual enrollment. That's also one more way to showcase rigor, and you're pushing the curriculum. Do you have to? No. If it's appropriate, if you've maxed out your APs and your IBs at your school, or there's a class you want to take not offered at your high school, for sure. Dual enrollment is great, but is it required? No. If you do well in it, sure. That can be, part of the transcript, part of application, showing you are ready for advanced level classes. All right, y'all. We're rocking and rolling. Everyone have a great night and look forward to the next time. If you need help, let us know. We're here, and everyone be well.